Welcome to another spin class. I've got my good friend Ryan here today. And one of the great things I love about having my own podcast is I get, phone calls or emails from people and say, have I got a story for you? And you sent me a beauty of a story that I am looking forward to digging into today with all kinds of great references and really just talking about Grandpa Bumpa, and we're going to learn about him today and all the really connections within your music family. So Ryan, thank you for being here on Spin Class today.
Well, thank you for having me, Rob.
It is my pleasure. Yeah. So like I said, you sent me a great email with a bunch of details of what you want to talk about today. So start it off. Tell me a little bit about Grandpa and let's start weaving through that story.
All right. Well, long story, right?
Yeah, that's okay. We got time.
My grandpa came here at 8 or 9 years old. Mm-hmm. He, Sicilian immigrant. His father had been here for a while. This was in the, early 20s. His father had been here for about 5 years from what I remember. And so he came over 8, 9 years old, literally Ellis Island, just like the movies, just like the stories, came with his young brother. They could only afford 2 tickets, so his dad sent for his 2 boys to come on over and goes through Ellis Island, gets on a train, ends up in Chicago to meet his dad, who he hadn't seen since he was 3.
Do you have any idea why his dad ended up in Chicago by chance? I'm just curious. I know it's going back a long ways, but
from what I know, and historically, when you look back at what was going on in Sicily in the 1900s to the 1920s, it was not the greatest place to be.
Yeah.
You really had to overcome quite a bit of kind of like class system issues.
Yeah.
And this was the opportunity.
Yeah.
I mean, this was the U.S. was the land of opportunity.
Yeah.
Maybe it still is. I don't know.
Yeah.
But certainly at that time, he was trying to create a better life for his family.
That's around the time, by the way, my grandparents came from Italy as well around that time through Ellis Island. And I'm curious, by chance, have you ever looked up, you could find the logs of when they signed in?
Yeah.
Do you have it?
So we we were trying to get our citizenship.
Yeah.
And it was, from what we can understand, it was like one of those 1948 cases, they call it.
Okay.
Essentially, to get citizenship, you had to follow your either maternal or paternal line, and you had to kind of prove it. Well, it's difficult because the Sicilian birth certificates are not that easy to find, and the records aren't that great, especially back then.
Yeah.
We were able to find most of the things. We were able to find the log in Ellis Island.
Yeah.
He was. Now, here, he was James Vincent, but when he came over, he was Vincenzo Giuseppe.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So it was just very different, but they look at that and they're like, well, that's not going to fly here. Right?
Yeah,
so,
yeah.
So they had to change his name over. We were able to find it. There were plenty of Vincenzo Giuseppe, or just,
hundreds,
before, and then, James Vincent Lombardo, and Lombardo is a very common name.
Sure.
It's like Smith.
Yeah.
At that time. So you kind of had to, figure out, all right, well, what were the dates? What was the date of birth? And what was all that? And we ended up figuring it out. But the biggest issue was he naturalized to join the army.
Okay.
Instead of needing to naturalize, instead of making it a choice. And so some of that changes the rules of being able to become a citizen. Now I think, me and my siblings still can through that bloodline. It's an incredible process. You have to go either through the Italian consulate here, or you have to hire attorneys in Italy in order for it to happen. Very expensive from what I've seen.
So we can talk about this separately. I've actually gone through this process most of the way. I've got a little bit left to do, but sort of related to the story you said, this is funny. It's nothing to do with music, but so I was using like an agency or something, and they have people in Italy and they look for the records and all that stuff. And so they called me back and they said, well, we have good news and bad news. And they said, the bad news is we can't find your grandfather's birth certificate.
Yeah.
And they said, but we did find his baptismal certificate from the church. And they said, in Italy, that's even better than a birth certificate.
I believe it.
That's like such an Italian thing. I'm like, okay, cool. So
that is excellent.
Yep.
And you would think back then the names, like the number of people that must have had your grandfather's name.
Yeah.
And getting baptized. But it just happens to be like they find that town, they find that church.
Yeah.
Churches don't close there. It's not
yeah.
it's
That's
just a different
true.
thing.
Very good point.
Yeah.
Okay. I took
right.
us off on a rebel, but that was interesting.
That's okay. So yeah, he comes here. He's with his little brother.
Yep.
He comes to meet his dad, and coming from Sicily, their house was built like a stone house built into like the side of a mountain.
Sure.
Like literally. So when he got here, and he sees that his dad is living on Halstead in this kind of like, it's literally considered an alley shack, like in the back of back of another property.
Okay.
And now it would probably be like a garage or a shed.
Coach house or something.
Coach house,
even,
maybe
yeah,
it's even built into a coach house, exactly. But at that time, it was a dirt floor shack.
Yeah.
And that's where his dad was living. And I think I sent you this in the notes. The Sicilians at that time were not treated well.
Yeah.
They were just immigrants. They didn't speak English.
Yeah.
They had to just do whatever jobs were available.
Yeah.
So most of them were, taking just labor positions.
Yeah.
Working on railroads, working on buildings. Some of them were actually like, they were masons. Like they were
Sure.
carpenters. They could work.
Yeah.
But they couldn't speak.
Yeah.
And they didn't really have like the respect of like maybe the Englishmen that were coming over.
Yeah.
So they had to just kind of fend for themselves. And and these two kids, my grandpa and his brother, they come over and they are with their dad, and their dad's always working.
Yeah.
So they kind of fend for themselves, right?
Wow.
My grandpa decides, he's 8, his brother, or 9, his brother's a year younger than him.
Okay.
So he's like, all right, well, I got to, do some stuff. I got to take care of him. So he becomes a shoeshine boy.
Yep.
And he could play accordion like every young Italian boy can.
Yeah, exactly.
And,
I think everyone in that entire era.
Yeah.
Right.
And
it's funny.
Just, went out on the streets and played accordion and shined shoes. And that was, how he spent his time and growing up. But what was interesting is, again, I was saying these Sicilians, like they had to work. They had to work all the time. So his dad was out day, night, like always doing something.
Yeah.
And so my grandpa, who we called Bumpa, and I'll explain that in a second, he would spend his nights, he would leave in the middle of the night because he would hear parties and he'd hear music and that stuff. And so he'd leave and he'd go to the burlesque shows.
Yeah.
And he would bring his accordion and he would play there.
Yeah.
And he would shine shoes because he's like, this is where everybody is.
Yeah.
He got to enjoy the music, enjoy the nightlife at a really young age.
Yeah.
But he also got to make money.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's when you're shining shoes. That's when you're playing a little music. You're keeping people entertained as they're walking by, as they're going from club to club, restaurant to restaurant, whatever. It was a good move, I'm sure, on his part.
Yeah.
He was just very, even at that age, entrepreneurial and he's a hustler.
Yeah.
Cute kid.
Yeah.
And I'm sure very charming.
Yeah.
And now you hear a little kid speaking Italian, we love it.
Yeah, right.
Back then, maybe they did too. I don't know.
Yeah,
but,
who knows?
But it worked out for him at that time. But that being said, it was a very different time than it is now. And you just kind of had to make your way. Yeah. And he figured out at that young age that there was, more, something more than what he was, than what he saw living on, literally on a dirt floor in the back alley on Halstead. Yeah.
It's amazing. That's nothing inspires you more than being in a situation like that, right? I mean, there's so many stories of people that I know too, where I grew up in the western suburbs was almost all Italian. And a lot of them were, first generation folks that were, off the boat literally. And they worked like crazy. I know a good buddy of mine, we were just talking about this last night, is his dad, I think, dropped out of school in 4th grade or something and became a pretty big restaurant mogul. Like, if you've got the passion to work and that work ethic, like you can really do anything. So it's amazing.
Yeah, I agree. And then the inspiration too, if you're around it and you see it, you see these people and you see what they're doing, you see how they're spending their time, you see how they're living their lives. Yeah. And, at that time, you're talking about, the late 20s, 30s. Yeah. You're talking about like a real big dichotomy of haves and haves nots.
Oh, I'm
right?
sure.
Like, that nightlife had to be just like, eyes wide open, super glittery and fun. Yep. For a
spats
kid.
And zoot suits.
Yeah, absolutely. And
black pinstripe suits. Yeah. I can imagine it.
Yeah. So I think that, was really what kind of inspired him to say, all right, I'm going to do this. I'm going to be part of this. Yeah. And I can't imagine at that age, 9, 10, 11, 12, being exposed to all of that.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I also can't imagine getting on a boat without speaking English, traveling across the ocean to come here to a city like New York and figure out how to get to Chicago.
Yeah.
I mean, there's just, without speaking English. I mean, there's just a lot that, goes into that we take certain things for granted that we would never have to be in that
apps,
situation.
Right? No map
There's
quest.
none of that.
Yeah, right.
Although you and I didn't have that growing up either.
Yeah, right.
But I mean, we were
Speak for yourself. No, I'm just kidding. Yeah. No, I'm with you.
It was. So when you and I, when we decided I'm going to be on the show, like I called my aunt because like, all right, I need to talk to pretty much the oldest, the matriarch that's still alive and that was around for all of this, later. Yeah. And she's almost 83 years old. Yeah. Aunt Jeannie, Giannina Lombardo at the time, Giannina Hoffmeister. Yeah. Now Giannina Conley. Okay. And but anyway, Aunt Jeannie to me, and she just rattled off just a litany of stories. We were on the phone for an hour and a half, and she just told me everything she could possibly remember. And we had to verify some of the dates, and we had to bring some things together. But it was, I mean, some of the stuff I had heard bits and pieces for years growing up. But I'm his grandson, right? So I would hear this stuff when I'm 8, 9, 10 years old, and I don't care. I just want him to teach me how to play guitar. Yeah. But he wants to teach me, Mary Had a Little Lamb and, scales. And I want to learn Van Halen. Yeah. So it's those, those lessons didn't go didn't last very long. They didn't go very well.
Yeah. Right.
And that's okay.
I would love to hear a Van Halen version of Mary Had a Little Lamb.
Exactly.
Now, I'm sure AI can recreate that. Now that's going to be my mission after this.
Yeah. That's a good idea. Yeah. It would probably sound pretty good. But it's that kind of, Stevie Ray Vaughan did Mary Had a Little Lamb and it was quite good.
Oh, did he? I didn't even know that. Okay. Now I'll have to check it out.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But yeah, so those stories, you hear when you're a kid, and as much as you idolize your parents, your grandparents, whatever, you kind of dismiss quite a bit of it.
Sure.
And when you hear about it later and you start hearing, all right, what did they really do? What did they really go through? Who did they really play with? When you've started living a different life and you start learning respect for what people went through, now I'm like, oh my God. Yeah. How do they even know? Did they even know while they were in that state, in those positions, in that night after night, having those experiences? Did they even know what was happening? Yeah. Or was it just their normal life? Yeah. Because I'll tell you, it was just their normal life. Yeah. They didn't know. Yeah. There's
just, this is what you do, right? To survive and to get by and prosper. It's amazing.
You don't think for a second, hold on, I got to sit back and relish this because this is something I'm never going to, I'm never going to forget. I'm not going to have this again. Yeah. And, he kind of had that. Yeah.
For some reason, I'm kind of a family history, buff nerd, whatever you want to call it. So I've always been really into it. So I'm fascinated by doing the research and all that stuff. So it was really cool to see all the stuff that you came up with. It was just fascinating.
Well, so here are the story. Here are some of the stories, right? So he'd sneak out and he'd do this, and he'd be playing, accordion. He'd be shining shoes, and he'd be, staying out really late. Yeah. And the clubs would be shutting down. Yeah. And he would be at the big jazz clubs. These weren't tiny little clubs. Sometimes he'd be at the tiny little clubs, I'm sure, because, he was young and he was trying to figure out where he's supposed to be spending his time. Yeah. But he ends up at a few of these places when some of the big, jazz and blues greats were coming through Chicago in the 30s and 40s. Yeah. And, he had become talented enough through all of this, learning different things, picking up different things, that he wanted to, be a performer at 12, and he starts his own band and he does all this. But during those few years when he was first starting out, and he's out, how many 8, 9-year-olds, 10-year-olds are staying out till 2, 3 in the morning, right? But he did. Yeah. And he would hang around these clubs and he would stay while they're being shut down and while they're closing down. And some of these people would take a liking to him and teach him. Yeah. They put him on his lap. He would play piano with these guys that had just performed for 4 or 5 hours. Yeah. And he just became great.
Yeah.
You know, my aunt said the first person to like really take a liking to him that, you know, people would know is a guy named Art Tatum.
Yeah.
And Art Tatum is, you know, big time.
Yep.
And certainly at that time, he was huge. He wasn't from Chicago, but he would take up residency here and he would, you know, play for, you know, weeks at a time and then move on. And, and, you know, do it again. And that name stuck really with my aunt. And, you know, my aunt heard those stories probably, I guess it would have been about 12, 14 years after this was happening to him. Because, you know, it really wasn't long. I mean, people were having kids in their early 20s.
Yeah.
You know, at that time.
Yeah.
So she starts hearing this stuff, you know, as she's growing up, and she wants to be like her dad. So she starts learning piano as well. Later becomes a concert pianist, and we, you know, we'll talk about that. So she was the one I called because I wanted the stories. I want tell me as much as you can tell me.
Yeah. So Art Tatum, by the way, I had the luxury of you sending me a couple of these names, but so one of the things that I found interesting as we go through these names is like they're somewhat different genres of different folks that you mentioned to me. So Art Tatum was really more of I would call kind of like a ragtime pianist, right?
Yeah.
So different than some of the other names that you're about to drop. So I found that really interesting as you were telling me this story.
Well, so when we were kids, right, we'd go over to our grandparents' house.
Yeah.
And my grandpa would sit at his piano and he would just play.
Yeah.
And he would sing and he would talk and he'd tell us stories and he'd play and he'd do that. And it was like a performance.
Yeah.
And every time we'd leave, my mom and my dad would be like, you know, all night we had to listen to this.
Here we go again.
Blah, 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 you know, and
not realizing you should have been recording it the whole time, probably.
Right. I don't have one. I don't even have one recording.
No kidding. Yeah.
I'm positive my aunt does. I didn't ask for any of that stuff, but I literally have zero.
Yeah.
And we were always like, this is fun. It was like entertainment for us as kids because, you know, I'm one of 5 siblings.
Yeah.
And if we're going over to our grandparents' house, and this was like a nice house, and you know, couldn't run and you couldn't play. If you did, you had to go into the basement. And the basement was unfinished, you know, cement floors, you know, everything's in boxes. It was like storage, you know? So if he was going to sit at his piano and play, we were going to hang out and, you know, dance around or whatever and ask for him to play certain things. And it was exactly what you're talking about. It was this like blend of jazz kind of music. And it was never, as far as we knew, a standard because we didn't know what that was. We just knew it was
eclectic
this like
mix, right?
Groove, fun, you know, just music.
Mm-hmm.
And he could play anything.
Yeah.
You know, we were just like always awestruck where, you know, others would have said, you know, like my parents, like he's just showing off and he's trying to, you know, get all of the attention because he can't handle the fact that there's people in his house and kids, you know, running around. So it was what it was, but yeah. So when he was that age, you know, he was out hustling. Yeah. You know, he wasn't being brought to, you know, be entertained by his grandparents. He was, you know, he was out hustling and he was doing this stuff. And so he literally learned like all of these instruments from guys that were hustling and working. Yeah. Right. You know, for them, it was their life. It was their lifestyle. It was everything. It paid their bills and it paid their way around the country and around the city and wherever it is that they were going. They would go anywhere there was a gig. It didn't change anything for them. It was like, could I eat? Can I drink? Can I play? Do I have a place to sleep? And they would just, you know, go and play. And so he found that, you know, fascinating enough and inspiring enough and motivating enough that he's like, this is what I'm going to do. So he starts his own band at 12. He starts playing all over the city. Meanwhile, in these years, also had to, you know, through immersion, like all these other immigrants, learned English. You know, interestingly enough, and, you know, fast forward many years when he has kids, no one spoke Italian in their home. Mm-hmm. Because it's kind of what happened in our home. Because the struggles of being that kid that, you know, people don't want to talk to or hear from, you know, because you're an immigrant and because you only speak Italian and you're not speaking English, he decided, all right, we're going to be American. So anyway, at that,
you know, it's funny. I hadn't really thought about this until you just said that, but it's interesting how many people actually do learn other languages through either music or, you know, watching TV shows and stuff like that. Because I think about, you know, my cousins now in Italy, some of them are great at English, and you put on an American song and they can sing it. They know the words better than I
But
do.
they may not know what everything means. But
Well,
they
yeah,
can,
but they can
yeah.
say it,
Oh,
and
yeah.
it's funny how much that you learn from that. It got
Yeah.
me thinking, like, I got to really pay more attention to, I've got some Italian albums and stuff. I gotta really pay attention to that, and maybe that'll help me along because they're frustrated that I don't speak Italian. So
Yeah.
I gotta get it back on that. So,
I
but
believe
there's it's like a lot of things, you have that connection. It's like a muscle memory or something that happens with music where there's that
Yeah.
connection. So yeah. there's
Well,
something
in
to
the
it.
meaning, I mean, there's so much passion behind music
Yeah.
and behind lyrics
Yeah.
that you learn the emotion while you're learning those
Good point.
words.
Yeah.
And I think that helps translate it quite a bit.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Because when you're just looking at vocabulary and you're trying to just memorize flashcards or whatever,
Yeah.
one, of course, it's out of context, but two, you lose the emphasis on,
Yeah.
what would be important.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
I think music really bridges that. And then it has that other trigger in your mind that makes it memorable.
Yeah, that's the thing. Yeah, it's like a jingle, right?
Yeah,
From a commercial,
Exactly.
right?
Yeah. So needless to say, he becomes very good
Yeah.
and very well known in the, Chicago circles as a performer.
Yeah.
And when I say he could play everything, I mean, this is stuff I do remember even when I was little. So, how old is your grandpa when you're little? Late 50s, 60s.
Yeah, I know we were just talking about this. Yeah, it seems like they're 100,
Yeah,
but
but
they're actually
not.
about the age.
Yeah,
not too far
right.
from
I
us.
know they're not too far. So, but we would go in that basement that I said was all boxes and cement
Yeah.
floors. But what he had down there, when he would open up many of those boxes and many of those cases, he could play sax, he could play trumpet, he could play
Wow.
trombone,
Yeah.
obviously piano, he could play guitar, could play ukulele, could play accordion, and he was still, to me, not just proficient, but a professional.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
unbelievable.
Yeah.
And I, spent time with him well into my late teens and early 20s enough to know, like, this is no joke.
Yeah.
Like, this actually was his whole world.
Yeah.
Wasn't when I knew him, but I knew that was his life
Yeah.
before, and you could tell that those stories were not stories.
Yeah.
This
It
was his life.
legit.
Yeah. And then now, hearing some of the stuff that no one would have told us when we were kids,
Mm-hmm.
the burlesque shows,
Yeah.
the staying out till 2, 3 in the morning as
Yeah.
under 12 years old,
Yeah.
and sneaking out in the middle of the night from your shack, leaving your little brother who's over here can't speak English.
Yeah.
Your dad's not there. No
Yeah.
one else is.
Yeah.
Until years later when his mom and other brother and soon to be sister
Yep.
anyway came over, and it was just kind of survival.
Yeah.
But that survival also, I think, just built this person, this persona, and this performer that
Yeah.
he became.
Yeah.
And because of those circles he ran in, he ended up getting some like pretty big gigs.
Yeah.
This one I didn't know about until talking to my aunt, that he performed on TV, like one
Yeah.
of the first televised performances of Sally Rand and it was in Chicago,
Yeah.
the fan dancer, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
he
Which is
performed
burlesque.
before,
Yeah.
And he
Which is-
performed before her.
I'm shocked to know, first of all, that it was even on TV, right? I mean, that's amazing.
It was
yeah.
like a big deal. It
Oh,
was
I would
like
imagine.
it was because she was
Scandalous,
censored.
probably.
Yeah, she was
Yeah.
censored, and there was a lot of problems with it. And I'm sure, I mean, there wasn't like a FCC kind of issue at that time, but now, obviously things became a little bit more censored, later. But that
maybe
was
because of her fan dance.
you got to wonder, like, that whole era, it's like in that Prohibition era, and
Yeah.
people were still trying to figure out, like, what's problematic for society versus what is good for the economy.
Yeah.
And,
Good point.
And, government was obviously very different, which actually is a good lead into these next things. So as he's playing through his teens and his early 20s, he's playing up and down the areas that we still go out in Chicago now.
Yeah.
That are still these famous areas like
Yeah.
Rush Street,
Yeah,
State
yeah.
Street, and
Yeah.
these places, and they were like raided frequently.
Yeah.
And even though it was, the police, you're talking about, the Irish police, the Italian mafia,
Yeah.
a very differently run entertainment scene
Yeah.
of Chicago than now,
Sure.
as far as we know.
Slightly different. Slightly,
right, maybe
slightly
slightly
different.
different. And you have to live it, and you
Yeah.
have to be willing to do
Play
it.
the game, right? Yeah.
Absolutely. It's that you're paying to play.
Yeah.
You're literally paying to play,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
you're getting paid to
Yeah.
play.
Yeah.
And everything is
You
this
get paid and then
exchange.
you got to pay off
Yeah.
the other people. Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Everything's an exchange
Yeah.
of money, of contacts.
Yeah.
A lot of it was who you know,
Sure.
which is still is in almost every industry.
Yeah, right.
And those same privileges and protections can be those same risks.
Yeah. Yeah. Right.
And you got to make sure you don't look at someone the wrong way, and you got to make sure that you don't turn your back when you should be facing that person.
Yeah.
And when you're a performer, just like now, we idolize basketball players and recording artists and all that kind of stuff, but they're different pedestals.
Sure.
Then they were just performers.
Yeah. Yeah. You were there for someone's entertainment.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And everybody knew it.
Mm.
There were people who were super famous, and they were treated a little bit differently than the people who were like the local entertainers.
Yeah.
And my grandpa was a local entertainer.
Yeah. Yeah.
He was like a hired gun.
Yeah.
He's the guy, like, that's the guy I want playing piano for my gig tonight.
Yeah. When
That,
the big names would come in, they knew that
I want
they wanted to
him.
have that.
I want this. I want that.
Yeah.
And
he's the equivalent of like a studio band. Or
exactly.
Whatever, right? Yeah. Right.
Exactly. But in his late teens, I think that maybe he tired of that.
Yeah.
And so he became he literally like went on tour as a music director on the trains.
Yeah. That's so
and
cool.
started touring throughout the country.
Yeah.
And performing and entertaining on trains.
Yeah.
Which is where he met my grandma.
Yeah.
Who was from a well-to-do family in Oak Park. And
okay.
they I am 100% positive from everything I've heard that my great grandpa was not very happy that his daughter fell for a train entertainer.
Yeah. I would imagine. Yeah, right.
That he was a very good businessman.
Sure.
And, she was, Scots-Irish, basically like royalty, right?
Yeah, yeah.
To him. And then you get, this Sicilian immigrant, playing a piano
Probably made
and
for some
accordion.
awkward Christmas dinners and stuff, I would imagine.
It was not what everybody signed up for, but it
Yeah.
ended up, married 58 years and all that kind of stuff, giant family. But yeah, so he did that. That actually brought him into the war, so he joined the war. He was a program director, USO.
Yeah.
So he didn't actually, he didn't have to fight so much.
Yeah, right.
But you see everything.
Sure.
And by that time, my aunt was born. My uncle was born.
Yep.
And he came home, from the war and was.
And your dad was after?
My dad was born in 1947.
Okay, got it.
So he came home, and essentially, my grandma became pregnant with my dad.
Yeah, yeah.
But she said everything was different. My grandma was like, so my grandma's super smart.
Yeah.
She was literally a graduate of IIT. So you think
Oh,
about
cool.
someone,
Wow, at that time.
a female
Yeah.
at that time, she graduated Illinois Institute of Tech.
Wow.
So she was like, one of the first females, in that group of college educated people in the States. And that was a very big deal. And so when she would tell us some of these stories, it had a different weight, than even my grandpa telling me these stories, even though, he was a high school graduate, whatever, but I knew you could tell he was an entertainer and hustler and performer.
Embellishing maybe here and there. Yeah.
But for her, she would, talk about this stuff. And she was like, he was a different person.
Mm-hmm.
He was different. Mm-hmm. And, which I think is expected.
Yeah.
And she would talk about, how kind of important he was before, and when he came home, he had to figure out some other things.
Yeah.
But at the same time, she wanted to encourage him to do all the things that he had been doing before.
Yeah.
And he felt that really was rewarding at the time. But I think, your eyes open when you see some things that that you can imagine in wartime. But he dove back into music.
Yep.
Started, built his name back, and actually played with some other pretty impressive people.
Yeah.
And actually brought an album, Oscar Peterson.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Pull it up here. Yeah.
This is not an album that he played on because this was done
Yeah.
in the 60s. But
Yeah,
I
yeah.
grabbed this because I love this one because this
Yes.
was recorded in Chicago.
Yep.
Unbelievable. This guy.
So
But-
good.
But they're
Yeah.
around the same age.
No kidding, really.
So the thing was, I guess when he came through, you know, there was a local piano player that wanted to really impress him. Maybe he could, maybe he couldn't.
Yeah.
Who knows?
Yeah.
But he ended up playing with him instead and ended up learning. My
Yeah.
grandpa ends up learning from him.
Wow.
Because this guy is
Holy
like,
cow.
this guy's like the guy.
Unbelievable.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So he teaches him a whole bunch of stuff, and they start throwing these after parties
Yeah.
at my grandparents' house.
Unreal.
And my aunt's telling me all these stories. She's like, the people that would come to our house after 2 a.m. and stay till 4 or 5 in the morning
Yeah.
just jamming
Yeah.
at our house, in our yard, in our living
Yeah.
room. She's like, you name them, they were here.
Wow.
She's like, Mr. Meriwether. And I'm like, wait, who's Mr. Meriwether? And then she's like, you know, I forget what they called him, but
Yeah.
we knew him as Mr. Meriwether. So I look him up.
Yeah.
And this is, what was it? Big Maceo?
Yeah,
Is
yeah.
that-
Yeah, Big
And
Maceo,
so
yeah.
I Google
Yeah.
and I start listening.
Yeah.
I'm like, oh my God.
It's fantastic.
This guy's in your house? And
Yeah.
she's like, yeah, but we didn't know. We were kids.
Yeah, yeah,
We
yeah.
were told, call him Mr. Meriwether.
Yeah.
You know? And,
No kidding.
and it's him and it's Oscar Peterson and these other
Wow.
people that, you know, maybe they're big names, maybe they're not. I don't know because
Yeah.
I don't, you know.
I mean,
it
these are
wasn't
huge. You know,
our-
I don't know if you know this. He's won 8 Grammys.
Yeah.
And more of your, what you would consider, I would consider anyway, kind of classical jazz.
Yeah.
You know, but incredible piano playing. Yeah, I mean, these are legit stars of that time.
Yeah, this is
I
huge.
mean, it's amazing.
And I read somewhere he's like from Ohio and then moved to New Orleans and became
Yeah.
you know, huge.
Yeah.
And anyway, you
And
know,
Big Maceo is, and again, to the point I was making before, he's more of a Chicago blues piano
Yes.
versus the electric guitar,
Yeah.
as well. So it's really interesting to me because they had, I would have thought it'd be interesting to dig into this. Like, they were probably from different venues even. I wouldn't think they were even playing at the same places, those guys. So your grandfather must have really like got around.
He was okay. So
Yeah.
interesting you say that.
I had a feeling we were going to go there.
Because that's one of the things that I've heard. And you know, my grandma was this, you know, sweet, tiny,
Yeah.
you know, woman who, you know, my sister is like identical to her. One
Oh,
of my
yeah.
sisters looked
Yeah,
identical
yeah.
to her. The rest of us look, you know, very Italian. And then,
Yeah.
you know, my sister's got that little bit, but then the rest is just this tiny, you know.
Yeah.
And it's interesting, you know, she would never, ever, you know, kind of like talk about that or cross her husband because she's this like, you know, prim and proper woman. But the stories I hear from my dad, my aunt, you know, the stories I heard from my uncle, you know, earlier, and then some of my cousins who were far older than me, because there's many of us. Yeah, he wasn't a great dude.
Yeah.
You know, my grandpa, you know, as I think kind of expected in the entertainment industry of the 30s and 40s, you're going to be.
And always.
Always, right? He's
Yeah.
out there, he's performing, he's, you know, entertaining other people and being entertained. It wasn't necessarily, you know, the best of you know, relationships from what I hear.
Yeah.
You know, needless to say, I think that's probably par for the course for a lot of these people that, you know, were probably coming over to that house also.
Yeah.
You know, it was a different kind of life.
Yeah.
And in the end, I mean, he had incredible performances, incredible friends, incredible teachers, and it lasted. And, you know, when you're talking about those that where it's like different genres of music that kind of came together and created this other thing. And I'm sure really the Chicago blues scene probably like blossomed from all of that came through. Because you're getting, you know, people from all over the place coming through here because this is a major location to perform, but also a thoroughfare to get anywhere else, right?
Yeah.
And he picked up on all of it. And some of the things that he taught me, you know, were interesting. They were, you know, taught to my dad first and then taught to me by him and then by my dad. And they're little like scales. So my son is already, you know, accomplished musician.
Yeah.
He's 15 years old or almost 15.
Yeah.
And plays drums, keys, just taught himself sax. He's teaching himself bass and guitar. I mean,
We got to get him over here. Where is he?
It just like, it just comes to him and it's great. I love it. And, he was probably 5, I think 4 years old. We had just moved.
Yeah.
And my daughter was taking piano lessons.
Yeah.
And he's in the background, and he gets up during one of the breaks, and he goes onto the piano and starts doing what she was doing.
Oh, wow.
And it's like a digital,
Yeah.
rolling piano that we had. And the teacher, who was like a teacher from the school that my daughter was going to,
Yeah.
and she came over to teach, piano. She kind of looked, she's like, does he take lessons? And she's
Yeah.
like, he's really good.
Yeah.
And so this just came to him. And then,
Yeah.
so she's like, maybe he should be taking lessons too. And
Yeah.
so it just kind of blossomed
Yeah,
into
yeah.
him. But anyway, I bring that up because he later on, he's taking, more piano lessons or whatever from at a school of rock.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And
Huge fan. I've talked about it on the show
Yeah.
many times.
yeah, I
My
mean,
boys are in it, and it's amazing.
excellent.
Yeah.
I mean, just the camaraderie that they build and that whole community
There's,
that they have.
I can say nothing but good things about
Yeah.
it. So we're gonna plug School of Rock as much as we can.
Absolutely.
We've got so many
Yeah.
people that we've encouraged to join. The stage presence, the confidence it gives to the kids. Whatever formula they have for teaching the kids, it's unbelievable. So yeah,
I agree.
that's
It just
great.
instills this not just interest but like excitement.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
And to
Good
learn
point.
anything.
Yeah.
And so, for instance, he's learning some songs, and he's like, "Dad, do you know any, scales or any, anything?" Because I played guitar for a long time, and I played with a bunch of my friends, and we played more like blues rock,
Yeah,
country
okay.
rock,
Yeah,
classic rock,
yeah.
that kind of stuff, and like a blues scale. And I'm like, "Sure," and I like teach him this like.
Yeah.
Right.
Mhm.
And he's like, I don't know how you're doing that. So I show him, and then he goes and shows his teacher. He's like, what's that?
Yeah.
And his teacher's like, that's not even a real scale. It's not even a real scale,
You're
right?
not your grandfather,
And-
is what you're saying?
Yeah. And I'm like, well, maybe not.
Sounds like it to me.
Yeah. But I know that this is what they played.
Yeah, yeah.
And they would be doing something like this. And then someone else would be like, oh, I see what they're doing. And then they would do something else. And then I see what they're doing.
yeah.
Jamming was different then.
Yeah.
I think than it is now. A lot
Yeah.
of stuff is
More
like
technical,
overproduced.
Yeah.
It's even with what is it, the voice, the
Oh, yeah,
auto tune
yeah,
and
yeah,
all that kind of stuff.
auto-tune, yeah.
But no matter what, you can make anything happen now.
Sure.
You can just pull up a program and say, all right, I want to I mean, there's apps like AI apps, right?
Sure.
You can say, I
Yeah.
want a country western
Yeah.
sound but rock, pop rock.
Yeah, right.
And
right.
I want it to sound like Tim McGraw and
Yeah.
whoever.
Yeah, right.
And it'll just do it.
Yeah. Scary.
I mean,
Yeah.
it's nuts. But then, you had to create your own thing. And which is, again, School of Rock plug. I have to say, like, that's the one thing they realize, like, no, you have to learn to do this.
Yeah,
You
right.
have to learn to play,
Yeah.
and the kids want to, and,
Yeah.
and they get excited
Yeah.
about it. So he goes and he does this, and teacher's like, I don't know what that is. I've never heard anything like that,
yeah.
And he comes home, he's like, well, he said he doesn't know. And
You
I'm
lied
like,
to me, Dad.
yeah. And I'm like, listen, man, like music is like what you make
Yeah,
and
yeah.
what you want it to be.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden it was just like this fascinating switch.
Yeah.
And now he's got, 5 friends over, and they're in the basement, and they're writing their own music, and they're playing their
So
own things.
cool.
And some of the songs that they want to learn that are, that's like already recorded songs, they're not trying to learn like modern rock.
Yeah, yeah.
They're learning like Carry On My Wayward Son from Kansas.
Sure, yeah.
They're
right.
learning songs 50
Yeah.
years old.
Yeah.
That were like,
Hey, don't say 50.
I know, right?
I mean, it is, but I don't want to hear it.
I know,
Yeah,
I know, but
Yeah.
it's so interesting to me because it's like, all right, well, they're learning songs where these guys wrote it
yeah.
and played it
Yeah.
and performed it at the same, like they were able to do this
Yeah.
in real life, like in a garage.
Yeah.
This wasn't something that required all of this other
Technology.
technology,
and-
right?
yeah,
And
yeah.
it just kind of interested me to see this kind of coming full circle,
Yeah.
4 generations later.
Yeah.
Needless to say, now my son is, he plays in the jazz lab band at
That's
Libertyville High
amazing.
School.
Yeah,
and,
yeah.
And that's like what he loves to do. I mean, he
Sure.
plays in like 3 different bands plus
Yeah.
his friends, but jazz is like his thing. And he didn't know
So
because
it's
he
in the
never knew
blood.
my
It's
grandpa.
in the blood.
He never knew
Yeah,
him. He never
yeah.
heard anything. He never saw
Yeah.
anything. And so when he saw this album out, he's like, what's that?
Yeah.
And I'm like, oh, this guy, like, actually, he was a famous jazz musician, but he was one of the people that
Yeah.
actually played with my grandpa and taught
Yeah.
him some things. And he, listens to it, can't believe it. He's like beside himself.
Yeah,
He's,
right.
oh my God, right?
So there's two things I want to ask you about the names that you went through. So I mean, some really iconic musicians for that time period. So the one thing I notice is all of the three names that you mentioned, very much known for piano.
Yeah.
And I just thought that was interesting. I don't know if you had any observation about that, if you noticed that connection or not.
I did, and I think most of it, when his first instrument, right, was accordion.
Yeah.
And I think that was part of it. It was like the whole idea of fingers and keys.
Yeah.
And knowing that you also, when you play a piano, you're playing percussion, melody, rhythm.
Yeah.
You're
all
doing
at once.
it's all together.
Yeah.
And he, in his heart and in his, mind and in his training was really an entertainer.
Yeah.
And I think with piano, you can really be that.
Yeah.
You could be a great guitarist.
Yeah.
You could be a good, wind player.
Yeah.
You could do this stuff, but to really be an entertainer, you got to play the piano.
Yeah, right.
Certainly at that
you
time.
had to have that bass.
You have to be able to just walk up to something and just jam out and that's I think was really what got him so excited and it paid his way for a long time.
Sure.
But we were talking and but wait, no, go. You were
well. So I have one other thing.
Yeah.
Is I'm sure you noticed this, but like also all black performers.
Yeah.
And so I mean, it is impossible for any of us to imagine what the environment was like for people at that time. But even these performers, as great as they were and they're winning Grammys, it's glitz and glam. They want you to come in, they want you to entertain them. But obviously their life was very different the minute they stepped off stage. And so I find it really fascinating that, here an Italian immigrant and these black musicians have formed this, friendship and this bond, and they're coming over to their house. Like, I think that's just amazing.
Well, so the Sicilians, when they came here, they were not necessarily treated the best by your average, American Caucasian. Yeah. And the people that they worked with and the people they hung out with were mostly the black people.
Yeah.
And, they were the ones that gave them jobs. They were the one that gave them opportunity. They were the ones that really became friends.
Yeah.
And that's what worked for him.
Yeah.
And that's how he learned. And when he was going out and hanging out, he was a cute little kid playing an accordion and shining shoes.
Yeah.
But you didn't see a lot of, well-to-do white kids doing that.
Yeah, right.
But a dark-skinned Sicilian boy that couldn't speak English, he, gravitated towards the black performers.
It's really cool.
Yeah.
I'd love to explore that more and learn more about those friendships that were made and how that all happened. Like, because you wouldn't think, even today you hear about all the, obviously it all exists and stuff, but you hope, and there's certainly progress has been made, but like to think about at that particular time, the fact that they would have forged that friendship, I think that's really cool.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
It was, hearing about it, growing up in the 70s and 80s, was different then.
Yeah.
Far different in today's climate.
Sure.
Hearing about it then, but at the same time, you read the books, you know what history, at least what we're told about history, you see it, you read it, you're like, makes sense.
Yeah.
I get it.
Yeah.
It's not that surprising to think that, they probably weren't treated very well.
Yeah.
And
right.
who was going to accept them?
Yeah.
It wasn't like he was moving into, some unbelievable house on Astor.
Yeah.
Right? He was literally moving onto a dirt floor shack on a homestead.
Yeah.
And now not far from Kingston Mines.
Yeah. Right.
It's that kind of.
It's probably one of the places he went to watch burlesque back in the day.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly. So, it's just totally different time,
Sure.
Different experience than we can possibly imagine. But, during, that heyday came with a lot of crime, a lot of danger, and a lot of, I would say, risky, and risque, enjoyment.
There's a reason those words are so closely
exactly
enunciated. Yeah.
And, one night it just got horrible and, raids on all of the, on the restaurants, on the clubs, and, it was just, beatings and police coming through and a lot. It kind of, I think, scared him, really disillusioned him. Stories I've heard, are, I think, very gray.
Yeah,
And likely he was probably way more involved than the stories tell, because he played with, everybody.
Yeah.
He played he played with the Rat Pack.
Yeah,
With
you
them?
said that, yeah.
No, probably for them.
Yeah, right.
Right? He's
right.
probably like, we need somebody tonight.
Yeah.
And was it all of them? No, it was probably 2.
Yeah, right.
It was that kind of stuff.
So
It's like,
love
all right,
it.
we're in
Incredible.
here. We're
Yeah.
going to go up there. Yeah, we're going to sing a few songs. And he's on keys.
Yeah.
It was likely that stuff.
Yeah.
But, when you hear this stuff from your, grandpa when you're a kid,
Yeah.
and then you hear it later from your aunt,
Yeah.
It's like, all right, well, how do these years line up?
Yeah,
And so I was going through and I was trying to match up. I'm like, oh yeah, I get it. And
Yeah.
I see how it all falls into place.
Yeah.
And the more I could do to research to really find out, like,
Yeah.
what is it? What's
Yeah.
real? What isn't? The more I realized, oh yeah, this was probably a really bad time. He's a Sicilian, whatever, Italian, last name Lombardo.
Yeah.
Is he involved? Is he attached? Is he not? Like,
Yeah,
there's a lot of that
Questionable
yeah.
things. Yeah, right.
So he decides he's not going to do this,
Yeah.
and he starts like a marching band that
Yeah.
performs at places like Soldier Field.
Yeah,
He
yeah.
starts a music store and a
Yep.
music conservatory kind of place. He opens a clothing store, and decides, I'm not going to be out there performing anymore.
Yeah.
Did he do that because he was scared? Did he do that because he had to? Did he do that because my grandma gave him an ultimatum? I have no idea.
Yeah, right, right.
I don't know.
Yeah.
Right. But I can
That
tell
sounds
you, you know what? I have a picture.
Yeah, you got to show me. You showed me before we started filming. It's incredible.
So look at this. Well,
Oh, the pictures. Yeah. Then I want to see the album. Yeah.
So this is my grandpa and
Oh, cool.
this is my dad.
Okay.
This is my Uncle Vince. This is my Aunt Jeannie.
Oh,
this
my
is Aunt Eloise.
gosh.
That is Bumpa.
Wow.
And that is my grandma.
Oh my gosh. I mean, he looks like, if you imagine somebody like playing at the clubs, people are getting dressed up and everything, like you could totally see it.
So that's in 1954.
Bumpa, Vincenzo Giuseppe Lombardo. Wow.
So this is when he basically
That
stopped.
is so cool.
This is when he was stopping performing. Like, it was right around that time. He's like, I'm done.
Wow, no kidding. Very cool. Gosh, these old pictures are amazing.
Yeah,
That's
right.
So cool.
And he was, at this time, I think is when he was. So he had his music store and his clothing store, and and then he started teaching at the American Conservatory of Music. I think it was called.
Yeah.
And then it became an extension of University of Chicago.
Chicago,
And now I think
right?
there's still a part of it at like some museum of music here or whatever, but it's not. I don't think it's like truly functioning the way it was.
Right.
This is a few years later. My aunt is playing in that picture, and she became a concert pianist.
These are like
right.
Frank Sinatra, every one of them.
This is 59.
Different versions of Sinatra.
So this is 1959, just a few years later from that picture.
Cool.
And she became like very famous in like these, industry circles and university circles.
Sure.
And I mean,
Jenny.
she's outstanding. Like I brought one of her records.
Yeah.
And
Look at, I love the tie clip. Like these guys
yeah.
are styling and profiling. I love it.
Just a few years later, so she elopes with actually like her siblings' help, and moves to Indianapolis, gets married.
Okay.
Ginny and a Hofmeister, and becomes
nice.
a very well-known concert pianist.
Yeah. Unbelievable.
And plays everywhere.
Look at this.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
How special is this? Not many people have this kind of pedigree, man.
Oh no!
This is amazing.
Read some of this because this is like a description of her. It's fascinating.
This looks like where is this? I wonder. Not Indiana, is it?
You know what? It might be because there's unbelievable places up and down Meridian Street in Indianapolis.
Oh my gosh! I will have to check this out. This is incredible. See, this is going to get sold out now. So check out the record store. Probably not on Amazon right now, right?
You never know. You may have to search for it. But she's the one I called, right? She's going to be 83.
Yeah.
And when we were talking about doing this, I'm like, I'm going to call the one person that would have all the stories.
Wow. And so she obviously got it, and other uncles and
my uncle is kind of estranged. My dad's passed.
Yeah.
The Aunt Eloise is so young. I mean, in this picture, she doesn't remember anything that they all remember. And, my dad had told me stories growing up, but a lot of things he didn't really want to talk about.
Yeah.
Because I think he saw the bad stuff.
Yeah. He saw it
Meanwhile,
Yeah.
my aunt's just kind of mesmerized,
sense.
in some ways because she's learning to play. But I
Yeah.
think a lot of it also is you're also forced to do it.
Yeah. Yeah.
When you're the son of an immigrant,
Yeah.
or the daughter of an immigrant,
Yeah.
much of what you decide to do isn't your own decision.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. That's a really good point.
Yeah, you think you're making that decision,
Yeah.
but it isn't. You're just told this is what you're going to do.
Yeah.
And so he actually dragged her quite a bit to other places to perform, to kind of show her off and be like, look what I did.
Yeah.
Almost like a plastic surgeon would bring their project
Yeah,
now to
yeah.
these meetings. Like, look what I did. It was that kind of thing.
Right.
And luckily for her, it became this incredible experience and lifelong, career. And she really made something of herself in music. And I think that, maybe made all of that worth it. But, growing up in a house like that, it was not fun. None of them have like the best things to say about what it was. Now, when we're thinking about it and talking about it, you and I love these stories because for us, it's like, oh my God, look who he played with and look what he did. But to have all of those experiences and to be that person, you couldn't have been a very good person to be able to pull it off at that time.
It's sort of easy to nitpick those things that work,
the
positive stuff, right? It's like you talk about, traders. Everyone talks about the traders who made millions, and they don't talk about the ones that lost their ass.
No,
no, and plenty of those out there too.
And it wasn't just theirs. They lost their homes, their kids, livelihoods, their college educations, their the car they just gave their 16-year-old kid. They're like, oh, that just got repoed. Like, it's just a different. It's a different thing. We know you never think about that stuff. And all these performers, friends, family, married to athletes, some professional. It's like, that is a very difficult life.
Yeah.
And, it's the same thing with performers, right? Like, it is not, the world that they live in, either revolves around them or they revolve around it.
Yeah. Right.
And it, having family and close ties and responsibility to other people versus an industry or versus your career, it's a real difficult balance. And I think it doesn't matter if it's the 30s, or in the 40s and 50s, or
the 20s, the 2030s and 2040s are coming around pretty quick here.
Yeah.
Hopefully I'm around for all those.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Well, this has been really awesome, man. I'm so glad you gave me this, wonderful tour, these great connections. It exposed me to some new music that I wasn't familiar with before. So I'm super appreciative of that. And we're at that point in the show where I always have to ask the popular question, which is, now that you've been on Spin Class, is there somebody that you would love to see interviewed on Spin Class?
There's one person that I would say I think you would probably be very fascinated with. I, through a series of my own career choices, ended up befriending Billy Corgan, Smashing Pumpkins, right?
Okay.
And probably one of the most intelligent, well-educated, and self-educated people I've ever met. Yeah. I had a chance to spin records with Billy and hang out with him at his house. And I'm amazed at what he knows about music history. Most of the time when I would hang out with him, I'd go into his house and he'd be sitting at his piano, writing music that you hear now as Pumpkins. Right? But he's writing on a piano, and it's just this beautiful sounding stuff. And I'm like, why don't you play stuff like that? Because it's not going to sell. I'm not going to sell that. Yeah. This is just how I write. And it's really unbelievable.
Oh my gosh.
I would say, if you get a chance to bring someone like that,
I would love that. We've been to Madame Zuzu's many times. I'll have to say.
Zuzu's
so big fan. Yep. We try not to bother him. He's almost always there. Yeah. But Billy, if you're listening and you're watching Spin Class, we'd love to have you. Come on down. It's not too far away from you. And I think that would be awesome. So if you next time you bump into him, if you want to mention to him,
absolutely.
About the next hot up and coming podcast. He's got one of his own, which is fantastic. And you're right. He is very much a music historian, and that's something I love. I love that. I love sports and stuff as well, and I love when people pay homage to the people that came before them and even around them. When he talks very favorably about the different people that were in the same time period as him, and all that those guys were going through and stuff. And yeah, it's really fascinating. So I pay attention to a lot of the things that Billy's talking about. So
Yeah.
we'd love to have him on board. So excellent. Well, Ryan, thank you so much.
Thanks, Rob.
And we will look forward to learning more about Bumpa and checking out the great music that he was affiliated with. And thanks everybody for joining us again in another fascinating spin class. We'll see y'all soon.